Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor. And before we start our episode today, please like, share, comment, and subscribe if you like what we're doing here on Plotlines. And today I am graced with the epic YouTuber Apostolic Majesty. Welcome back, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Connor, for that accolade, and thank you for inviting me back on. It's a great honor to be here.
No problem. It's an honor for me to have you on. So we're talking about Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and King of Spain. Arguably, would you say he's the first King of Spain since Spain wasn't united prior in some ways?
It's rather confusing, actually, because he spent most of his reign actually co-reigning over Castile, co-reigning over Castile with his mad mother, who was locked in a tower, unfortunately. Um, it was interesting. I mean, it depends how you define Spain. Under Charles V, Spain remained as two separate kingdoms, the Kingdom of Aragon in the east and the Kingdom of Castile. If you want me to be pedantic, you could say that Spain, as we know it, wasn't really created until the 18th century. But he was one of the early kings of Spain in the sense that he ruled over both monarchies, and he was the first one to rule over both monarchies in his own right. His grandfather, Ferdinand, had ruled over Aragon, and his grandmother, Isabella, had ruled over Castile. Hence, their Catholic majesties ruled jointly, but never in their own right. So, yes, in that sense, in terms of ruling over both kingdoms, he was the first king of Spain as we know it.
Yeah. And there was a whole, or sort of, he first started as Duke of Burgundy and basically ruled from there as a child, basically overseen by his aunt and by his grandfather Maximilian. It's interesting that he sort of took the place of what his father would have done, because his father died so young, Philip the Fair. Um, but yeah, so I mean, he has this such wide empire, starting in Burgundy and the Netherlands, and then inheriting Spain, and then inheriting the Holy Roman Empire. It's a lot to juggle and a lot to sort of gather, but a lot of his advisors were from the Netherlands, weren't they?
Yes, his most well, in terms of just elaborating on that as to how that happened, there's a saying in Latin, but I'll just use the English translation, which is "Others may wage war, but you, dear Austria, will marry." So, despite the fact that the Austrians have never had or the Habsburgs have never been great warriors or had a great martial tradition, from the middle of the 15th century up until essentially Charles V is the culmination of 50 years of incredibly lucky and incredibly successful dynastic politics. On the one hand, the Habsburgs start off with Austria in the 13th century. By the time of Charles V, they have gained what is Burgundy, say, for example? Well, Burgundy consists of parts of eastern France, Artois, the French Comte, and most of what is now the modern day Benelux, so Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands, whilst at the same time, due to the marriage of Charles's father, Philip the Fair or Philip the Handsome. I use Philip the Handsome to distinguish himself from his French counterpart, Philip the Fair, a rather infamous king of France during the early 14th century.
Gotcha.
Um, he married Isabella, the daughter of Isabella, Joanna of Spain, Joanna of Castile, and through that marriage connection, she was never expected to become the Queen of Castile in her own right. There are a lot of, you can say, for the Habsburgs, fortunate accidents that happened in the preceding years up until 1506. But by 1506, Philip was the Lord of Burgundy, master of the Netherlands, and a large part of France. And he was also, by right of his wife, the King of Castile as well, though he never ruled as King of Spain because his father in law outlived him as well. So coming back to Charles V is born in the year 1500. He's not known as Charles V because he's not elected or crowned as Holy Roman Emperor. Rather, he is known as Charles of Ghent. And he's brought up in the Netherlands is interesting at this time because After the death of one of his ancestors, Charles the Bald, Charles V and his ancestors, Mary of Burgundy and his own grandfather, Maximilian, who still reigns as the Holy Roman Emperor, have to abide by a great charter, a Magna Carta in the Netherlands. You have all of these powerful nobles exerting power throughout Belgium and the Netherlands. And in order to try and obfuscate this and allow for all of these, local interests to take control of the young king, the aunt of Charles V, Margaret of Austria, is placed as the regent and ostensibly there to defend his interests. And when he finally comes to power, reaches his majority in 1516, it's actually part of a ploy by one of these local Burgundian notables, Decroix or Chivres, who is trying to undermine the authority of the regent and believing that a hapless young prince would actually be far easier to control than his aunt.
Word from our affiliate, Bishop Sheen Rosaries. You've probably worn through the chain of your cheap plastic rosary. Other rosaries simply can't stand up to the wear and tear of everyday life. Bishop Sheen rosaries are made of solid metal beads and paracord to withstand any condition, and are backed with a lifetime warranty. Upgrade your rosary to a Bishop Sheen rosary made to fit your lifestyle, or buy one for a friend. Each rosary sold supplies 2 weeks of food for a school kid in Uganda. You use the exclusive link down below to help support our efforts here at Plotlines. The link will take you to sheenrosaries.com. Be sure to use the code Plotlines10.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It seems though that without his parents, without really anybody, and with him being so young, it seems like he is easier to manage than his aunt, who is a very sort of powerful figure as governess of the Netherlands, and she governs even after he leaves, right? After he leaves to be crowned king of, leaves for Spain to take over Aragon and Castile.
Yeah, she briefly comes back. Effectively, what the Habsburgs are always in need of is reliable and loyal managers for all of these disparate realms, which are not only are they disconnected from one another. So, for example, there's no land bridge connecting the Netherlands with Spain. There's little in the way of connecting the Habsburg possessions in Italy at this time, which have only recently been conquered, they have to maintain maritime access to those territories. In order to connect the territories of Spain in northern Italy, they will later develop this thing called the Spanish Road across Western Germany. And again, there's the importance of maintaining that link between Austria and what will later be Bohemia and Hungary, all Habsburg provinces together. So the whole point of having sort of spare Habsburgs, as it were, is to allow them to be loyal local administrators who will rule on the behalf of the, you could say the equivalent sort of pater familias, the head of the household. And at the moment, Charles isn't even the head of the family because his grandfather is still reigning in Innsbruck in the Tyrol in Austria. And Maximilian is a fascinating figure because he is responsible for a great deal of artistic patronage in Germany and Austria during this time, in particular his patronage of Albrecht Dürer, one of the exemplars of the German Renaissance. And he also patronizes a series of chivalric books and novels and these great epic block print images, which can be essentially displayed and replicated all across the great mansions of the Holy Roman Empire as well. So Maximilian is consciously trying to make a myth of the Habsburg dynasty. And Charles is therefore being brought up in the era of both these courts, the Burgundian inheritance with the Order of the Golden Fleece, founded by his ancestor, Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy, whilst at the same time his grandfather in his you can say idyllic court in the mountains in Innsbruck is too trying to make up this idea of a hallowed and sacred Habsburg monarchy at the same time, while there is of course the real concern of dealing with the French threat as well. And for France, this is an absolute disaster, having someone like Charles V, because all of a sudden, on all fronts virtually, France is now surrounded from the south across the Pyrenees, from the east if we look into Habsburg possessions in Italy, and of course to the north where the Habsburgs are not only the Holy Roman Emperors, but they also control the Netherlands as well. So Charles is simultaneously in a very powerful position, but he's also in a very dangerous position. And at the same time that he is becoming king, you have a new, very ambitious and powerful monarch in France, Francis I. Francis I takes the throne, marches into Italy, and very quickly he destroys a Swiss and imperial army at the Battle of Marignano, which temporarily gives northern Italy back to the French, and he becomes the Duke of Milan, the King of France. So at the same time, while this is going on, there are a lot of Burgundian nobles who are under the authority of Charles nominally, who actually want to bring peace with France. They want to create a system of détente whereby they can hold on to their possessions, their French-speaking possessions on the periphery of the empire, and they can actually facilitate Charles's own passage from the Netherlands into Spain. Why, for example, do all these Burgundian notables, these French-speaking notables, it should be also noted that even though Charles is from a German dynasty and he goes and becomes king of Spain, his main language is French. He leaves Ghent and marches south on the back of this political sort of machinations of his then would-be advisor, Chevreuse, to go and occupy the throne of Spain and establish his rule there. Whilst at the same time, Chevreuse and his own allies are coming on and they're pocketing all the benefices and the wealthy sort of dioceses within Spain and occupying all the top jobs. And because this is very much seen as a Burgundian conquest of Castile, the Burgundians made themselves very unpopular very quickly. But all of this happens on the back of, you can say, incredibly complicated sort of diplomatic maneuvering between the French nobles who are loyal to the emperor or would-be emperor and France. I know this sounds very complicated, but it's very complicated when you put this in the sense that we're not talking about nation states. We're talking about individual domains, which historically have had no reason to be connected apart from through the idea of dynasty, through the connection to the one ruler, which is Charles, who has, by happenstance, inherited all of these territories very quickly. And as you mentioned, he's growing up without the influence of his parents either. He's growing up with without a father who has died, I believe, in 1507 or 1508, I can't quite remember, and Joanna, who is mentally unstable and remains basically locked up in Spain while she is technically the Queen of Castile. So therefore, it's of great sort of interest that all these influences are trying to jockey him to leave Burgundy and take up his throne in Castile. Also for the fact that if he never went to Castile, it is likely there would have been a revolt anyway and possibly a new contender to the throne or a very weak central authority under his mother, who was also, stark raving bonkers at this time, I'm afraid.
Yeah, there's a lot to get into there. First of all, this is kind of an odd question for the topic, is when since Maximilian was ruling from Innsbruck, what drew the archdukes of Austria to eventually rule from Vienna instead of Innsbruck, if Maximilian was ruling from Innsbruck originally?
Yes, well, Innsbruck is a bit of an anomaly, really, if you think of Habsburg history, because throughout many times, Austria has not been one territory. There has been Upper Austria, there's been Lower Austria, there has been Styria, and there has been Further Austria, which parceled out. Some territories are actually in modern-day Swabia in Germany, some are even in France. This dates back from the fact that the Habsburgs didn't start off in Austria. They conquered Austria. They started off in Switzerland. So you see all these little patchwork of territories strewn across what is now modern-day Switzerland and northern Germany, connecting back. Maximilian, the reason why he resided in Innsbruck is because it was the only territory for the majority of his life which he actually held in his own right. It was his own territory because his father was still alive throughout most of his life, Frederick III, and ruling in Vienna. So rather than, when his father finally died and he became the Holy Roman Emperor at the end of the 15th century, rather than leave his court in Innsbruck, he simply stayed there.
Gotcha. And then with Charles V, or let's say Charles of Ghent, coming in with all of his Burgundian nobles, into Castile and into Aragon, was he pro these notables, or was he just going along with them because that was who was in charge of him, basically?
I think it's I mean, during Charles's early life, Charles was considered a bit of a butterfly. He was fascinated with the heraldry and the imagery of the knights, of course, growing up in the chivalric court of Burgundy. Really, the court of Burgundy is the last hurrah in terms of medieval myth making and emblemizing and celebrating codes of chivalry, despite the fact that Burgundian wealth was built on the back of merchants and trade and ultimately international finance. Is a bit of contradiction. So he's fascinated with this, and he has very little in terms of political instincts or even a sense of home at the beginning. The fact that he's willing to abandon what had been his home up until that point in Flanders and retreat and become the ruler of Castile. But there's also a part of political necessity which is driving his own coterie to bring him there, because even though his mother has been ruling there, effectively not ruling there, but simply been incapacitated there since 1506, his grandfather, Ferdinand, finally dies in the year 1516. And this motivates him and his Burgundian court, in addition to declaring his majority, to bring him over there to try and have some form of any real authority, royal authority there, to avoid it simply lapsing and the regions becoming very unproductive and almost useless for the Habsburgs, essentially ruled by their own notables. So Chivres de Croix notices a huge amount of opportunity of using the prince to enrich himself and enrich his nobles by establishing Habsburg authority in Spain, which hitherto had not been established at all, even though Philip technically ruled, his father technically ruled as King of Spain through his wife for a year. He never established any sort of firm Habsburg authority. Spain had been dominated by King Ferdinand, the widower of Isabella, for around 30 years at this point. So really, when he dies, there is this huge vacuum in Spain, and Charles and his advisors come into Spain to try and fill it briefly from 1516 up until 1519, when his grandfather in Austria, Maximilian, finally dies.
Did Ferdinand of Aragon try to impose or try to bring about his the second son, Ferdinand, also named Ferdinand, to become or to replace him in Spain? Because I know he was living in Aragon or Castile while Charles was still in Burgundy prior.
That's an interesting question. Indeed, Charles had a younger brother, Ferdinand, who was raised in Spain and was far more familiar with the Spanish nobles. And again, that was one of the reasons why there was this impetus to rush down and for Charles to claim the throne as well. Because, Spain, unlike somewhere like France, which has a strict Salic law, whereby the male heir to the throne is always determined on this genealogical list, in Spain, that wasn't the case. There had been civil war after civil war throughout the 15th century in Spain, with various, not just brothers, but cousins and family members from Portugal, Aragon, and Castile fighting over the throne. So yes, had Charles arguably not gone down there and established his rule in Spain, there was the real possibility that many of the nobles could have supported Ferdinand against Charles as basically a Spanish equivalent, because when Charles came down, he was derided as a foreigner who couldn't even speak the language. So very early on, there was this attempt to naturalize the young Charles, to make him Spanish, to make him learn Castilian, and to make him resident in Spain.
Did that ever sort of get achieved? Was he ever Spanish enough?
I think that's probably true. It's a rather remarkable achievement, and this is what you can say transitions the Habsburg monarchy in the West away from being the House of Burgundy to being the Spanish monarchy, the king, by extension, the Kingdom of Spain, because he does become more Iberian. This is slightly sort of later in our time period, but the Comuneros revolt in Spain very much spurs on a reform movement in Castile. And thereafter, from the 1520s all the way up until the 1550s, when Charles finally abdicates and retires to a monastery in Castile, he remains, all of his political power, his manpower, most of his tax base, even his residences are mostly based in Castile. And to the extent that, with the exception of the Pragmatic Sanction in the Netherlands in the 1540s, he basically leaves the rest of his realms alone. He doesn't introduce sweeping reforms across Italy, nor does he introduce sweeping reforms even in the neighboring Spanish kingdom of Aragon. The old administrations, the old parliaments, the old legal systems, which are very different, even the language, very different from that of Castile, are all left alone. And Castile becomes his own power base, a site for reform, for bringing the nobility back under control. And you can argue that Charles V was very, very successful, to the point that when his son Philip II finally becomes King of Spain in 1556, Castile becomes again the whole bedrock of the Spanish Empire, not just in Europe, but also relying on Castile's vast colonies, which have been established in the New World: Mexico, Peru, Colombia, later it'll be Argentina, and of course Hispaniola and Cuba. And even if we taking Portugal, expanding into the Far East and the Philippines as well.
Yeah. We also talk about the is it the Trastamara, is the Spanish dynasty. The Habsburgs are the German dynasty. And then what is the title for the Burgundian dynasty? I've never actually heard of any specific title for them.
I mean, of course, it's the male who provides the family name when it comes to the dynasty.
Oh yeah, I know.
So,
I just mean of the sort of how
oh yeah,
came
yes.
about.
Well,
I don't mean
what?
that I know he's
Yeah,
just a Habsburg.
yeah. Well, what the Burgundians had been up until 1479, when Mary of Burgundy dies prematurely. Sorry, it might be a bit later than that, I'm afraid. I can't exactly remember the exact year. When Mary of Burgundy falls from her horse, I believe it's in the early 1480s, she was the last direct sort of scion of the house of Valois Burgundy, which was an extension of the French royal family. I believe the throne of Burgundy was established during the time of Charles V in the 14th century. So they were very powerful nobles in the French realm, establishing their own French dynasty, and that is how the House of Burgundy came into being. But when Archduke Maximilian goes over in 1479 and he marries Mary of Burgundy, all the scions of the House of Burgundy become the House of Habsburg. The only reason there's a distinction between the House of Burgundy and the House of Austria is because a major sort of innovation of Charles's is to empower his brother Ferdinand later on and make him the Archduke of Austria. And Ferdinand will later become the King of Bohemia and the King of Hungary. Thereafter, you have an Austrian branch of the Habsburg family, and you have a Spanish branch of the Habsburg family. But because the Spanish branch comes from Burgundy, it is called the House of Burgundy. I know this is all very confusing, but it's just sort of more conventional to call them the Spanish Habsburgs or the Austrian Habsburgs up until the death of Charles II in 1700.
You know, it's a funny little it's funny how all these different pieces work. But Ferdinand sort of, or once Charles becomes the Holy Roman Emperor with the death of his grandfather Maximilian, Ferdinand really becomes the power player in the German side of politics. Did they have a brotherly relationship? It's also stated like you're good. I think Charles V said wrote to his brother that he was his good brother and good father. I think that's what he said. Did they have a good relationship, or was it messed up a bit?
I think, as with all of these things, it was mired by the nature of politics in Europe at that time. They weren't raised alongside each other. Like I said, one was raised in Burgundy, the other one was raised in Castile. But you mentioned Ferdinand becoming the power broker in Germany. Well, can I explain as to why that was?
Yeah.
Because, as previously mentioned, Maximilian ruled from Innsbruck. All of a sudden, Maximilian is dead, and now there's a power vacuum. Charles, it's not necessarily entirely obvious that he is going to become emperor as a fait accompli. even though he has the best dynastic claim to the throne, because the Holy Roman Empire is not hereditary, it's an elected monarchy. And so, in order to speed up the process, Jacob Fugger, the banker who had supplied and helped the patronage network of Maximilian, gave vast amounts of money to the various ecclesiastical prelates and nobles in Germany to ensure the smooth succession of now Charles V, the elected emperor of the Romans. And thereafter, from 1519 until 1521, he presents himself in Germany, and he makes a rather enduring impression on Germany when he convenes the Diet of Worms in 1520, which is meant to deal with the whole issue of German sort of rulership and Reichsreform, etc., etc. But there is one notable addition to the proceedings, which is the admonition and the ban against one Martin Luther. Martin Luther, of course, had been making waves in Germany, in Wittenberg, since 1517, and he had a powerful patron in the form of the Elector of Saxony. So a number of German princes are using Luther and his admonition against the Catholic Church and the papacy as a pretext of essentially securing their own positions against the emperor. Now, what is fascinating about Charles and his branch of the family, Philip II especially, is that Charles is fundamentally and fervently Catholic, whereas Ferdinand and his scions, his progeny, are less convinced. They're much more willing to take a realpolitik attitude towards religion in the empire, but Charles isn't. So when he is confronted with the heresy of Luther, Martin Luther, rather than offer a conciliatory attitude, Charles admonishes him and basically bans him. But of course, he has very little power to actually do anything, because the Holy Roman Empire is a decentralized network. It's not a German state as we know it today. He holds a lot of dynastic possessions in Austria, southern Germany, and of course the Netherlands. But Saxony is very far away from the center of Habsburg power. So unless the German princes are willing to collaborate with him, Martin Luther is essentially untouchable. And what happens next only sort of confirms that. Martin Luther is not the only religious leader at this time who is opposing the papacy. We have Thomas Müntzer and the Anabaptists throughout southern Germany. And the Anabaptists make waves throughout the peasant population in Germany to the extent that they begin prosecuting their own war for many reasons. But Anabaptism is a fundamental component of the German peasants during this time, against not only the imperials, the Habsburg authority, but all the nobles as well. This goes on throughout the 1520s, and the rebels are crushed. Rather than weakening the Protestant position, this actually confirms it, because Luther, rather sort of, he publishes a manifesto against the thieving, murderous, barbarous peasants. He very much nails his colors to his princely patrons, and later we see the princes of Hesse and the princes of Saxony and the German princes of Swabia and Franconia consolidating their own power at the expense of the peasants. At this point, Charles has left Germany. He's made his impression, he's convened his diet, he's declared his authority as emperor and has been elected. Now he's left and gone back to Spain. So this is where Ferdinand becomes an important figure, because Ferdinand has been left in Austria as now the Archduke of Austria to deal with this local German situation. But he doesn't have the manpower and he doesn't have the resources to actually do anything about you can say the expanding Reformation in Germany, because it's being patronized by German princes. So at the same time, the Austrian emperor and his viceroy in Germany, Ferdinand, is having to protect the rights of the German princes while having to deal with heresy. So if the German princes begin to protect the heretics, there is a fundamental contradiction there. And in order to do anything seriously, you have to wage a war against your own princes within the empire. And it's not that simple either, because if the emperor decides to wage war against his own princes, you bring in a potential European coalition against you, mainly France, who is using any opportunity to weaken the central authority of the Holy Roman Emperor as well. So it's a bit of a quagmire within Germany, as you can see. And this isn't the end of it. That's you can say a flesh wound to the Habsburgs, because in the East, the Ottoman Empire is gaining momentum. Suleiman the Magnificent has just come to the throne. And in 1526, just as the Great Peasants' War is beginning to wind down, Suleiman the Magnificent destroys the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohacs. After centuries of Hungarian statehood, all of a sudden, the entire Hungarian government is virtually collapsed, and they appeal to Ferdinand to basically save them. And by extension, it makes it even more complicated because the King of Hungary is also the King of Bohemia as well. So Ferdinand, after 1526, becomes the King of Bohemia and Hungary, but that means he's now responsible for dealing with the Ottoman threat. So he's dealing with the Islamic armies of the Turk in the east and in Hungary, and he's dealing with the Protestant Reformation in Germany and the South at the same time. This isn't even bringing really France and France's contributions into the fight. So you can't really envy Ferdinand I in his position and how he has to weather these storms. And that's just one part of the empire. That's simply the outer periphery of the empire. And this is why I think it's very important to look at the relationship between Charles and Ferdinand. Because when we get to the end of Charles's reign in the abdications, you can say that Ferdinand ultimately betrayed him by confirming that the Austrian branch of the family would remain Holy Roman Emperors and the Spanish branch would be cast out of that position forever. So why did Charles give his brother so much power? Well, honestly, because he needed it. He needed the uncontested authority of the estates, of that power base in Austria, of its vast mineral wealth, and all the troops he could basically muster to fight both factions. But also, if Ferdinand was the Archduke of Austria in his own right, then it's a much simpler process for him to become the King of Bohemia and the King of Hungary, because he is a sovereign and his legitimacy is much greater than that as a mere deputy for his brother at the same time. So really, you can say, in hindsight, Charles made a grievous error in doing something which would permanently divide the House of Habsburg in two. Yet on the other hand, had that not happened, it is very much possible that Bohemia and Hungary wouldn't have come under Habsburg authority, and the Habsburgs would have been that much weaker when dealing with the Ottomans at the same time.
Do you think Charles considered Ferdinand would consider it a betrayal by Ferdinand, or was he just too worn out at that point to even care?
Well, I think the wearing out of Charles at the end of his reign in the 1550s is as a response to his betrayal, rather than him not really caring about the betrayal, because Charles unfortunately enters a deep depression in the 1550s, which contributes to his abdications, giving up all of his thrones one by one, and him going off to live in a monastery. Because Ferdinand, the assumption had been that Ferdinand will become Holy Roman Emperor. However, when he dies, Charles's son will become Holy Roman Emperor. It was basically a pact to ensure that both sides of the family had to remain loyal to one another, had to remain allied, and that when they died, they would pass the throne back between themselves. But Ferdinand went beyond that and, of course, coveted not only the title for himself, but for his sons, and indeed his line in perpetuity. And it is that line of Habsburgs that endure up until Blessed Charles in the 1920s. And it is the descendants of Charles V who die off much earlier in the year 1700. So from that point of view, as a dynast, I would consider it a betrayal, especially at the point that we're looking at, disloyal nobles, the Protestant Prince of Saxony, the King of France, who was also a Catholic, stabbing you in the back at the same time. Charles was beset by many problems, which all contributed to his, you can say, mental collapse in the 1550s. But I can understand for viewers that might be a bit confusing as to why that happens, because this is 30 years in the future. But nevertheless, Ferdinand was empowered, you can say, rather, politically adroitly by Charles, because Charles realized that he needed to give his brother that power and that confidence in order to establish a real powerful center of Habsburg authority in the East to deal with the Ottomans and to deal with the German princes and the Reformation at the same time. If anything, he didn't have enough power to deal with these problems.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting though. I've never thought about those situations between the brothers as much as that. I always thought of them as partners, kind of, but that was but these types of things aren't gone into for the most part. The reason why you have your channel, or one of the reasons, is because you're taking on things that the English speaking world doesn't really get into very much. And I think it just goes to show you how limited our sort of viewpoint of these politics are, where it just seems like, oh, the Habsburgs are here, the Habsburgs are there, oh, they are no longer in Spain because they died out. But really, it's sort of more, it's much more, there's so much more depth that is missing from our understanding of it. Because, like I said, I wouldn't have thought of Ferdinand keeping the title as betrayal. It almost seemed to me as the branches just maintaining almost somewhat of an equal power base. But it does make sense more there when you look at how Burgundy stayed within the Spanish branch, and then Austria, became its own power, branch. It makes sense that, if you were trying to keep Burgundy in the empire, you would have thought the Holy Roman Emperor would have control over that area because it's part of the Holy Roman Empire. But that all comes from the fact that the King of Spain wanted to keep the whole empire together.
Exactly. That's precisely the thing. And the whole point of allowing Spain to be more interconnected with the empire would ensure that the Netherlands and Austria facilitated each other economically and militarily. Hence, we create the Spanish Road. And of course, ignoring the fact that the Holy Roman Empire technically also consists of parts of Italy as well. And this is where we get into quite a few things which sort of stem from the points you've made, Connor. One is, what was Charles's own conception of monarchy? Because it really sort of starts to come about after the Comuneros revolt in Spain, which is mainly pitted against there's basically a nationalist rising, whilst at the same time it had elements of a peasant uprising against the local nobility. So Charles is able to effect many reforms in Castile after that. But in terms of his own understanding of his brother's relationship to the imperial throne under Charles V and all of his other allies, and indeed not just the Habsburgs, but all of Christian Europe, I believe that Charles V viewed this as an extended order of the Golden Fleece. He was the Grand Master, and to some extent he was responsible for mediating all of the disputes of the members. All of the members, however, were loyal to him, and fundamentally they were Christian rulers who would serve the emperor in his would-be crusade against the Turks in the east and in combating heresy throughout the empire. To my mind, that was his fundamental conception, and this is why when he goes to the Diet of Worms and he denounces Luther, to my mind, there are many political expedients as to why the emperor would actually lean on Protestantism, because it would give him an excuse to go around and nationalize the monasteries, but also to attack the papacy as well, which he was often in conflict with. So why doesn't he do this? Because he believes that to be Catholic, to be Habsburg is to be Catholic, that to go against the Catholic Church would be a corroding or basically a defiance of the system which had been established by his ancestors. His ancestors had been glorious, heroic Catholics. Maximilian had established this whole sort of dynastic pageantry, emblems of the dynasty as Catholic. So Charles receives this information, goes in, again, in terms of just all the influences which are compounding on him, all these various luxurious European courts which are informing this image of the grandeur of the Habsburg dynasty. He comes to Worms and proclaims that as a dynast, as a Habsburg, I can never countenance this heresy. I can never countenance Lutheranism. And this very much informs everything going forward and his relationship with European kings, because after the Comuneros revolt, Chevreuse and his Burgundian nobles are basically cast aside because Charles V understands that they are a political liability. And instead, we see the rise of an Italian from Piedmont, which isn't actually one of the territories which Charles actually rules over, one of the few he doesn't rule over. Called Mercadino di Gattinara, and he is created as the imperial chancellor of the new universal monarchy of Charles V after his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor. Now, Gattinara really wants to reinforce this idea that Charles V is the hegemon of Europe. He is the leading monarch in a crusade against heresy and against the Ottoman Empire. However, he also believes that he is a second Charlemagne. He is a Carolingian restorer of the Western European ideal of monarchy as well, that he is a Roman emperor in addition to being a Christian king, and that in order to be a Roman emperor, one needs to establish one's authority in Italy, of all places. Italy is something we haven't really mentioned this time, but again, it demonstrates the multifaceted nature of Charles's universal monarchy, that we can flit through all of these different places. And this comes to where you can say the greatest triumph of Charles V, but also a triumph which he never effectively exploited, which again actually demonstrates that Charles is his own man rather than simply being dominated by his advisors. Because when Charles V becomes King of Spain, very quickly after, and he removes Chievres, the French Habsburg detente quickly breaks away. Essentially, the detente had existed simply to allow Charles to get to Spain. Now Charles is in Spain, the detente is no longer needed, and France is wanting to confirm his authority. And this isn't, something created by Charles. This was something going all the way back to 1494, 6 years before Charles was even born. And in 1525, against the French forces, the imperial forces defeat Francis at the Battle of Pavia. Not only does Charles defeat Francis, he captures him as well. Now we have to think of this in the broader concept of a European hegemon, or him as the principal monarch of all European monarchs, waging war against heresy and the Turks. Francis is a rather notorious and infamous figure if you're looking at this from the point of view of Europe as a Christian republic, because Francis is continually undermining the Habsburgs, using any and all means, whether it be appealing to the Protestants or indeed appealing to Suleiman the Magnificent against the Habsburgs. He is a central node of subversion if you're trying to think of this as Catholics versus everyone else, which Charles V very much was. Mercurino de Gattinara, the imperial chancellor, understood this, and he believed that after Pavia, Charles should simply hold on to Francis, believing he wouldn't rebel. At the same time, there is another European prince who is very ambitious and who wants to become the King of France. Can you guess who that is, Connor?
Henry VIII?
Indeed. Henry VIII has already put down his claim to being King of France. He's established himself in Tournai in Flanders, and in the years preceding Pavia, he leads several raids from the English-held Calais and the Pale of Calais down to Paris. He is defeated. He has to go back due to supply issues and various other reasons. But Pavia, for the first time, is not an English imperial joint venture. The English decide to sit it out, and Charles V wins this great victory. And you can say, to my mind, this is Charles V's greatest blunder. But again, like I said before, this demonstrates that Charles V was his own man. Mercurino understood, like I said, that Francis could not be trusted. So what was Charles V doing when he decided to release Francis and send him back to France and believe that he would be an ally? There was a much earlier medieval European precedent with France after the Battle of Poitiers during the 100 Years' War, when the Black Prince, Edward the Black Prince of England, captured the King of France, John II, John the Good. And John II willingly accepted his capture. He was ransomed off, and when he went back to France, and there was later a violation of his ransom when members of his family took up arms against the English, John II willingly put himself back into English captivity because he violated the terms of the ransom. Charles V, of course, being an avid sort of a receiver of this chivalric tradition, European history, understood this. And he believed that having captured Francis was honor-bound, duty-bound to give up his qualms in Italy and to accept, if not, being a fervent ally, then at least being peaceful towards Charles. And of course, this isn't what happens at all. Francis goes back. His mother has been ruling France in his stead, and he very quickly contrives of the League of Cognac, forms an alliance with the Medici Pope Clement VII, and the war in Italy is off and running again. And this is an interesting point in terms of what could have happened otherwise. One possibility is that Francis could have simply remained captured by Charles forever. The other possibility is that Charles could have done everything in his power to facilitate Henry VIII becoming king. Now, I'm rather cynical when it comes to history, and I don't believe that Henry VIII was had that much of a theological reason for separating from the Catholic Church when he did in the
Yeah.
1530s. So this is another interesting point when we're talking about potential alternative history. Had the aftermath of Pavia planned out differently, and had Charles effectively exploited his capture of the French king, he could have ordered Francis to renounce his throne and given it to Henry VIII, who would have become King of France. And thereafter, now he's not only the Catholic King of England, but he's also the Catholic King of France. He has all the more reason to remain loyal and happy with his Catholic allies, and therefore there is even less reason for him to defect and effectively do what he does, divorce and break from Rome irrevocably and create the English Reformation. It's an interesting idea to consider, and of course, this would have possibly been a benefit to Charles, because Henry VIII wouldn't have been readily accepted as King of France. There would have been many nobles who would likely oppose him. So you have a weak and broken French administration under a foreign king, which will benefit Charles, or it wouldn't benefit Charles, because Charles would need to actually station imperial troops within France to bolster the regime of his ally, Henry VIII. So many sort of interesting things you can point to, but what Charles does against the advice of his imperial chancellor is the absolute worst outcome, in the sense that he sends his arch rival back to France, who immediately begins plotting against him after swearing that he wouldn't do so. And again, this speaks to Charles as a fundamentally chivalric and honorable character, because not only does he believe that Francis won't do this, he can't force Francis to renounce his throne either, because he is an anointed Christian sovereign at the same time. So Charles is playing by a different rule book compared to Francis.
A rule book at all.
Yes.
Having a rule book is beyond King Francis. Yeah. Also, could he have taken the throne of France himself, since Charles V arguably had the better claimant, or not necessarily a better claimant, but could have claimed the throne of France, being the Duke of Burgundy, which
he had a very, very distant claim on the French throne, but the whole point of the English claim is that it goes back to the time of Philip IV and all the way back in the 14th century, when Edward III was cheated from the French throne because the French Salic law decided to go through the male line as opposed to the closest male relative, who Edward III was, of England. So by that extension, by that logic, the entire House of de Valois, which was also the House of Burgundy, would have been kept out of the throne of France as well. Even though, if we look at the War of the Roses and Henry VIII's own parentage and the Tudor dynasty, again, that's very sort of dubious in and of itself. But he is also a Valois, because he's descended from Catherine de Valois, who was the wife of Henry V and the daughter of King Charles Charles VI of France at the same time. So he also has a pretty good claim on both sides, from being a Valois, but also being a relative of Edward III at the same time. But also taking over France, if I were in Charles's position, I wouldn't have done so, because he would have been seen as a hostile conqueror. And it's much better to allow a weaker ally to fulfill that role, who actually earnestly wanted to become King of France, unlike Charles V. You can say a lot about him. Charles V did very little to actually extend his physical territory beyond some outposts in North Africa and the conquest of the bishopric in Utrecht in the Netherlands, which consolidated the Netherlands as the Netherlands we now know it today, in terms of that one united bloc. The only area which wasn't taken over, which is, again, me becoming more obscure in terms of my territorial knowledge, is the bishopric of Liège, which is basically Eastern Belgium, which was never taken over by the Austrians. So that's the fundamental point at which you can say Charles's fortunes or misfortunes really begin. Because, like I said, Francis leaves. He goes back to France and he conspires against ultimately what Charles had done, had been able to conquer most of Italy. He hadn't been able to conquer the Pope, though. The Medicis were never particularly happy with the Habsburgs. Indeed, the early Medicis had quite an interesting relationship with France. And Clement VII had a good relationship with Francis. Indeed, he would marry his the only sort of direct line, Medici, Catherine de Medici, off, and she would later become an incredibly important figure in French history through the latter part of the 16th century. So the Medicis are married to the House of France, and they have that connection through their alliance with the papacy. And what does the League of Cognac bring in terms of you could say the decline and the misfortunes of Charles V's reign? Well, it leads to the sack of Rome in 1527. Charles V, now believing that the Pope has turned against him, supports a local Roman family, the Colonna, against the Medici. The Colonna are very easily killed off, and so the Colonna, what remain of them, appeal to the largest army, which is loyal to the emperor in Italy, under a French defector, Charles de Bourbon, in Milan. However, this army is a mercenary army. This is a typical thing we see with a lot of armies at this time. They are paid mercenaries, often from Switzerland or from Germany. And indeed, many of the Landsknecht, or the soldiers in Charles's army, were Protestants. So they were brought to Rome ostensibly to help a warring faction against the Pope, and instead they sack it, partly because they're pissed off with their commander, also because they're feeling they're underpaid. So you have a Lutheran renegade mutinous army under the nominal authority of the emperor sacking Rome. It's a bizarre moment in history, but I also believe it could have been avoided had Francis remained in captivity, or had he been dethroned after the Battle of Pavia.
Yeah, France was willing to do everything to destroy or to take down the Catholic emperor, ally with the Ottomans, ally with the Protestants, and ally with the Pope, which is kind of funny. That sort of these three, it's sort of just this unity amongst Christendom that sort of leads to all these different problems. And Charles V, to me, he's intrigued me ever since I was in 5th grade, which is a decently long time for, or I was very young for that to take interest. But sort of this sort of wide authority over all these different territories, and being sort of this image of Catholic chivalry, is just such an interesting characteristic that you could almost say that would you say he is more chivalrous than his grandfather Maximilian? Because he's usually considered the last knight.
Yes, well, Maximilian is considered the last knight because he wanted to be remembered as such. He very much made a great deal about his journey to Burgundy to marry. Again, it's basically made into a heroic fable, the passage of the young Prince of Innsbruck to go and travel to Burgundy, a foreign land beset by, enemies within and without, to marry the princess and to protect her throne against the evil universal spider, who was the term applied to Louis XI, the King of France. You can very much see that in that myth making there is something rather romantic about it, ignoring all the plot
down.
Many sort of there's the White King. There are many sort of I can't remember exactly the names of them, but there are many sort of chivalric sort of semi-autobiographical pieces about Maximilian's life, which were patronized by Maximilian in order to give this impression. Whereas, Charles, I would say, Maximilian actually died in a rather good position. He died at the height of his power, having reformed the empire to some extent and having lived in sort of relative seclusion and happiness in his own court in Innsbruck. Whereas Charles was a man who actually had to deal with 3 major crises, 2 of which, Europe had never really dealt with before. One was the Protestant Reformation, which, even to call it a Reformation, I prefer the term the Lutheran Revolution. Because, of course, as you know, being a Catholic, the Catholic Church is always reforming. And indeed, this was a period of Catholic Reformation as much as it was a period of Protestant Reformation. On the other hand, you have the greatest expansion of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had been expanding into Europe since the 14th century, but now they were actually reaching the gates of Vienna in 1529. And they were poised potentially to expand into Italy and to expand into Germany. And then you have a very old rivalry between, well, actually, no, not so old in this grand scheme of things, the Franco-Habsburg rivalry, which will go on really up until the 18th century when we have the creation of the Pacte Famille. And then we have the resurgence of an old argument, which is the conflict between the emperor and the pope, between who has ultimate sovereignty and supremacy over Christendom. And so when we have figures like Mercurino de Gattinara, who dies in 1530, we see this reemergence of this idea of conciliarism, that the Catholic Church is, the authority of the Catholic Church is vested in the ecumenical council under the headship of the Pope and the Emperor, rather than this idea of papal infallibility at the same time. All of these ideas are cropping up, appealing to the Council of Constance and the Reformatio Sigismundi. Indeed, the Reformation plays into this as well, because Charles earnestly, throughout the 1530s up until the 1540s, when we have the Schmalkaldic War, which is the beginning of the end of Charles in Germany, earnestly wants to try and help the Reformation process in Germany through talks. You have dialogue after dialogue after dialogue, diet after diet after diet in Germany, starting with the admonition of his at the Congress of Worms. Then you have a much more conciliatory approach taken by the emperor. However, there is one fundamental sticking point for him. He will not contradict the Pope on matters theological. And the Protestants have a fundamental sticking point. They believe the Pope is the Antichrist. Given the situation, I believe that Charles's attempts, you could consider that Charles's attempts to reform Christianity during this time and have an ecumenical council of the church, which included not only Catholics and Protestants, was realpolitik in terms of strengthening the position of the emperor against that of the Pope. But you could also say, because he was also an earnest Catholic, as we mentioned earlier, that this was one of the most naive aspects of Charles V, again, believing that the Protestants would negotiate and come back into the fold under the nominal headship of the Pope, in the same way that he was prepared to trust Francis to act as his ancestor, John the Good, had done, in terms of accepting the parameters of his ransom. I believe he treated the Protestants in good faith. And when he finally came to the realization that the Protestants were not only never going to come back into the Catholic fold, but they were also threatening the connection between Austria and the Spanish Netherlands, it was actually a strategic impetus rather than a theological impetus that caused him to finally wage war on his Protestant nobles in the north during the Schmalkaldic League. The idea that all these territories are going to be cut off and the Protestants are forcefully beginning to expand and convert other princes at the same time. So as you can see, Charles is beset by problem after problem after problem, not just the problems of geography and having to maintain such a disparate empire with effectively, what's another way of explaining to him? Charles V is the lord of all, but he is also the lord of each. He doesn't rule over the empire as a despot. He is having to negotiate with his empire at the same time, whilst having to negotiate with the entirety of Europe. And the unfortunate thing for Charles V is that he proves ultimately to be a failure in that regard and dies a broken man.
I sort of a last comparison I want to kind of look at, and it's not really based on the same virtue or same moral level, but sort of the chivalry of the Habsburgs tend to be their downfall because they take the more optimistic view of humanity. They want people to be better than they are. It seems to me that his his descendant, or would it still be his descendant, or was Blessed Charles still his descendant?
Blessed Charles wasn't his descendant. It was the descendant of Ferdinand, not of Charles.
Not even through the female line, because I know there was.
Yes. If we're talking about direct male line, then no. If we're talking about the constant Habsburg state of intermarriage, then yes.
Yes. Okay. So it's still technically a descendant, just not through his male line. Blessed Charles is sort of so far the final Habsburg ruler. I would hope that won't be the case in the future, but at this point, that's what we can say. But his collapse, or the destruction of the Austria-Hungary, comes down to a sort of naivete regarding his enemies and regarding his allies, and this sort of, it's very similar. And both of them had, both Charleses had a a devotion to the Catholic faith, even though Blessed Charles is a blessed, obviously, and much more moral fortitude. What do you think about the comparison?
I think that's an interesting comparison. And it's interesting for two reasons, in the sense that, yes, you're correct. Blessed Charles was operating in a situation in which he essentially had no control. And he tried various means, notably the Sixtus affair, to try and rescue Austria from its German entanglement and negotiate in good faith with the Allies as an independent power, rather than accept the situation that Austria had effectively become a German vassal, and that its situation and Germany's situation was entwined and ultimately sealed the fate of the empire. When we look at Charles, Charles is the flip side of that. Charles is representative of the Habsburgs, facing seemingly insurmountable problems at the height of their power. Blessed Charles is the Habsburgs dealing with insurmountable problems at their lowest ebb, and ultimately just at the point of view where they're going to be extinguished from history forever. He may have been an emperor, he may have been king of Hungary, but Charles was in no way comparable on the relative stage of European power politics to the original Charles V in terms of his power to affect things. Charles V could feasibly, had several things gone differently, I mentioned, say, for example, the capture of Francis,
Yes,
have consolidated the Habsburg power in Europe even greater to the extent than he already did. I mean, I say that Charles V was a failure in terms of the big picture, but on a smaller scale, Charles V was a great success. He held the Habsburg provinces together. He prevented the French from expanding into Italy. He prevented the Ottomans from taking Vienna and expanding further into Europe. So the Habsburgs held under Charles V. They didn't become a universal monarchy or a world power under Charles V. And the Habsburgs began to split off. And then we have the great calamity and tragedy of the 30 Years' War. But there was a possibility of revival and, you can say, consolidation under Charles V. With Charles, Blessed Charles, I don't see any situation where that could have happened, other than the grace and mercy of the Entente powers, which was never going to happen.
Yeah, there was no mercy there. But yeah, so I think we should leave it there. Thank you, AM, for coming on the show. Thank you for enlightening me to a lot of things that I haven't thought about Charles V in the way that you've brought up, and I just want to thank you for your time, and please, everyone, go to AM's channel. He has just such great content, and it seems like it's never ending.
Well, thank you very much, Connor, and thank you for having me.
Yep. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Have a good one. Bye.